Snow swallowed the sound until only the crying remained, thin, ragged, fighting for life. A lone rancher reined in on the ridge, staring down at three newborn girls half buried in the drifts, their breaths fading like the last coals of a dying fire. A woman lay tied to a fence post nearby, skin cut raw by barbed wire, too cold to scream anymore. Someone had meant for all of them to vanish before dawn. But Gideon Hale wasn't the kind of man who rode past the Lord's test. Before we go back to the moment he stepped off that horse, and the war it unleashed, stay with this story until the very end and tell me where you're watching from. The Montana wind carried many sounds in December, but only one made Gideon Hale pull his horse to a dead stop on that narrow trail above the frozen creek. A cry, thin, splintered. Not a coyote, not a hawk, a child, maybe more than one. The kind of sound no man should hear alone in the snow unless the Lord himself meant for it to reach him. Gideon turned his head into the gale. Frost stung his cheek. His coat snapped like a torn sail. The land below him lay hard and white, a sheet of ice and judgment stretching clear to the pines. And there, faint, broken, came the cry again. He whispered, "Lord, show me the way," pressed his heels to the mare, and rode down the slope. The creek bed swallowed the trail. Snow rose to his stirrups. Brush scraped like wire under his boots. The wind shoved and pulled until Gideon had to lean low to see anything past the curtain of white. But then he saw it. A dark, twitching shape half buried near a fallen fence rail. Not one shape. 3 bundles, small enough to fit in his hands. Gideon slid from the saddle and dropped to one knee. Heat bled from his gloves the moment he touched the first bundle. Cloth stiff with frost. A tiny face beneath it, mouth open as if to cry but too cold for sound. The second bundle quivered, just barely, when his palm cupped the infant's back. The third did not move at all. The wind held its breath. Gideon ripped off his glove, pressed his bare hand to the still child's cheek. No warmth, no sound. Only a feather-thin tremor under the skin, then nothing. He lifted the child to his chest anyway, bowed his head, and let his breath wash over the tiny mouth. "Not yet," he murmured. "Not tonight. Not on Christmas week." Another faint cry fluttered from the first bundle, higher this time, sharper, as if begging him not to stop. That was answer enough. Gideon tucked all 3 infants beneath his coat, pressing them against the wool lining where his own body heat could reach. He rose, and that was when he saw the trail. Drag marks, deep, chaotic, leading from the creek bed toward the split-rail fence at the edge of the clearing. Gideon followed. The fence loomed through the snow like a row of crosses, the rails sagging under the weight of ice. At the center stood a post, long, thick, dark, with something that wasn't just weather. A woman hung there, wrists wired behind her, hair frozen to her cheek, head bowed as though in prayer she'd never finished. Gideon reached her side in 3 long steps. "Ma'am." His voice cracked under the cold. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her breath came thin, choked, a single cloud against the wood. Blood, dark, stiff, clung to the barbed wire cinched around her wrists. Whoever had tied her there meant her to die slow, seen only by the crows and the drifting snow. "Hold on." Gideon shifted the infants in his coat, braced her shoulder with one hand, and tore at the wire with the other. The metal bit deep. His fingers burned. The wire held. The woman stirred. Barely. Her lashes fluttered. For a heartbeat, her eyes opened, faded blue, rimmed raw from the cold. They locked on his coat, where a tiny foot kicked weakly at the wool. She rasped, "My girls." Gideon swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am. I've got 'em." The wind surged, flinging snow into their faces. The wire cut deeper. The infant stirred beneath his coat. The woman sagged, nearly taking him with her. Time was a blade, every second cutting deeper. Gideon worked faster. "Come on," he muttered, jaw tight. "Stay with me." The wire finally snapped free of the post. The woman collapsed forward. Gideon caught her around the waist, keeping the infants pinned safely against him with his forearm. She was lighter than she should have been. Too light. The kind of light that meant she hadn't eaten in days. Her lips barely moved. "Don't leave them." "I won't, ma'am," Gideon said, lifting her fully now. "You're all coming with me." The mare stamped nervously, sensing the storm thickening behind them. The cry of the first infant rose again, muffled under his coat. The second whimpered. The third remained frighteningly still. Gideon heaved the woman onto the saddle, holding her steady while she slumped forward. He climbed up behind her, securing her with one arm while the other cradled the bundled children in the warmth of his chest. The wind screamed across the clearing. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a dog barked. One sharp warning, then silence. The kind of silence that told Gideon they weren't alone in these woods. He turned the mare toward the ridge. "Lord," he whispered into the storm, "grant us the miles." The mare lunged forward. Behind them, the fence stood dark and quiet again, as if it had never held a woman's suffering. Ahead, the blizzard closed in, swallowing trail and sky and any mercy the mountains might have offered. But Gideon did not look back. The children were breathing. The woman was alive. And someone, somewhere, would surely come looking for all four of them before dawn. The storm thickened before Gideon had crossed the first ridge. Snow battered his coat, stung his eyes, and smothered every sound except the thin cries muffled beneath his wool. The woman sagged in front of him, barely held upright by his arm. Her breath warmed the saddle horn for a moment, before the wind tore it away. He kept his chin down, shoulders hunched over the three infants pressed against his chest. Every jolt of the mare's stride rattled through their tiny bodies. He could feel each tremor, May's soft gasp, Etta's faint whimper. But June lay too still. Gideon glanced down, shifting the bundles with his forearm. He pressed his thumb to the smallest infant's ribs. No motion, no rise, only cold. "Stay with me, little one," he murmured. "Not tonight." The mare stumbled on a buried stump, forcing him to grab the reins with his free hand. The woman moaned weakly, head dipping. Gideon steadied her, then urged the horse onward through another puff of wind. The cabin sat in a hollow carved by the Lord's own hand, tucked behind a line of firs leaning heavy with snow. Smoke from his morning fire still curled from the chimney, thin as a thread of hope. Gideon steered the mare straight for it. He slid off the saddle the moment they reached the porch. The mare snorted, shaking ice from her mane. Gideon hauled the woman down, careful not to crush the infants, then shouldered the cabin door open with one sharp shove. Warmth spilled out, thin but blessed. The fire smoldered low in the hearth, its light flickering across the rough planked floor. Gideon crossed the room in 3 strides, lowering the woman onto his cot. She sagged sideways, breath rasping. "Ma'am, stay awake if you can," he said quietly. "I'll come back." He moved to the table, clearing it with one sweep of his arm. Tin cup, a Bible worn soft at the edges, a coil of twine, then set the infants down in their bundles. Etta let out a protesting chirp. May blinked blindly toward the fire. June didn't stir. Gideon shrugged out of his coat and dropped it near the hearth so the wool could steam dry. He grabbed the iron poker, prodded the coals until the fire woke with an angry crackle. Flames climbed, orange and fast, casting heat across the cramped room. He filled a tin cup with snow, set it on the stove, then pulled his hunting knife from its sheath. "Lord," he whispered, setting the blade close to the fire, "steady my hands." The knife warmed. Gideon returned to the cot. The woman's wrists were swollen, raw, the barbed wire biting deep into torn flesh. Blood had frozen along the metal. Unwrapping her now would mean cutting the wire free, carefully, slowly, each twist a risk of scraping bone. "Ma'am," he said, lowering himself beside her, "I need you still." Her lashes fluttered. She nodded once, barely. Gideon slid the warm blade under the first coil of wire. The metal hissed against her skin. She did not cry out. Only her breath hitched. Once. Sharp. "Easy," he murmured, working the blade beneath the next knot. The wire snapped with a faint metallic pop, leaving her wrists trembling and slick with thawed blood. He shifted to the other side. The storm rattled the window panes. The fire crackled. The infants whimpered. Time moved in shudders, not seconds. One more twist, one more cut. The final coil gave way. Gideon eased her arms forward, guiding them into her lap. Her fingers twitched at the sudden freedom. He wrapped her wrists with the last clean strip of linen he owned, tying the knots as gently as his calloused hands could manage. Then a sound pulled his head up. June. A faint sigh slipped from the smallest bundle. Not a cry, just air. But it was enough. Gideon crossed the room, scooped the child up, and pressed her to his chest. He cupped his palm around her ribcage and breathed warm air over her face. "Come on now," he whispered, rocking her. "The Lord brought you this far." Another tiny sigh. Gideon closed his eyes for one moment, one heartbeat, then turned back to the mother. She was watching him. Barely conscious, but watching. Her eyes tracked every motion, every breath he gave the infants. "Your girls are safe, ma'am," he said quietly. "I promise you that." She swallowed. Her lips worked around a fragment of a word. "Please, don't. Let him." Her voice broke. Gideon shook his head once, firm. "No one's taking you anywhere tonight." He gathered all 3 infants inside his coat again, holding them close as he moved to bar the door. He slid the iron brace into place, then stacked 2 crates against the frame. Outside, the wind howled like a hungry animal. The woman slumped sideways on the cot. Gideon returned, pulling a wool blanket over her shoulders. The fire snapped behind him, throwing long shadows across the floorboards. He checked the window. Tracks were already filling with snow. Good. But not good enough. Someone would come looking. Someone always did. He turned back to the woman and the children he had taken into his home without a second thought. "Rest now," Gideon murmured. Then he glanced once more at the door. Solid, barred, but never beyond breaking. And for the first time that night, he let the storm's silence settle in his chest like a warning not yet spoken. The fire fought to live the same way the infants did. Weak at first, flickering against the draft, clawing through the chinks in the cabin wall. Gideon fed it pine splinters until the flames caught proper, rising gold and steady. Only then did he unfasten his coat and lay the 3 bundled girls near the edge of the mattress, close enough for warmth but far from the sparks. Etta whimpered first, a thin, hungry sound. May followed with a soft, fretful gasp. June remained motionless, her little face pale as the frost still crusted on Gideon's sleeves. He worked fast. Snow melted in the tin pot, turning to warm water. He tore a strip of clean cloth, soaked it, tested the heat on his wrist, then dabbed each girl's lips in turn. May drank greedily. Etta blinked, confused but willing. June barely parted her mouth. "Come on, little one," Gideon whispered. "The Lord didn't bring you this far to lose you now." He wrapped June in his hands, palms forming a pocket of heat around her ribs and throat. She felt as fragile as a bird fallen from its nest. His breath washed over her cheek, then her eyelids, then her tiny, cold mouth. He kept counting, 1 breath, 2, 3, rocking her gently in the cradle of his arms. A faint shudder traveled through her. Barely there. But enough. Gideon exhaled. Not relief, there wasn't time for that. Just one more fact he had to guard. He moved to Lillian next. The woman lay half-turned toward the wall, her skin chalky under the flickering firelight. Her wrists, wrapped in linen, pulsed with slow seepage where the wire had bitten deepest. Her breathing was shallow and uneven, as if each rise cost more coin than she owned. "Ma'am," Gideon said quietly, touching her shoulder. "I need you to drink." He helped her sit just enough to take a swallow of warm water. She didn't speak. She barely blinked. But her eyes moved, once, to the 3 children on the mattress. "My girls." "Yes, ma'am. Right here." Gideon pulled a wool blanket tight around her shoulders. Then he placed a second log in the fire, watching the flames swallow it whole. A knock might have brought comfort, but the cabin gave none. The wind rattled the shutters like bones in a tin pan. Somewhere far off, down in the hollow, a dog barked twice and fell silent. Cold crept in through every seam and nail hole. He had to seal it. Gideon grabbed 2 spare planks from beside the doorframe. He wedged one against the cracked window, using the heel of his hand to force it into place. The second he braced at an angle to stop the worst of the draft. The fire brightened. The room held heat a little longer. He returned to the mattress and placed 3 flattened coins beside the infants, 1 for each girl. Etta's coin bore a dent from his father's old hammer. May's had a scratch running clean across the eagle. June's, the smallest, was worn thin enough to flex when he pressed it. "Names matter," Gideon muttered, "mostly to the room, partly to the Lord above. They tell the world who's still here." Etta, May, June. 3 lives rescued from the snow by nothing more than a man who'd meant to ride home before nightfall. The woman stirred again. Her hand searched weakly across the cot, not for him, but toward the nearest bundle. Gideon guided her fingers gently until they touched Etta's shoulder through the cloth. "She's warm now," he said. A tear slid from the corner of the woman's eye. Not from sorrow. There was no strength left for sorrow, but from something smaller and sharper keeping her tethered to this side of the grave. Gideon looked toward the fire. Flames licked high, throwing light across the rafters. The Bible on the table lay open where it had fallen when he'd cleared space for the children. The verse showing, though he hadn't meant to leave it that way, spoke of shepherds in the night, watching over their flock when the Lord sent angels to announce the coming dawn. He wasn't a shepherd, not by any measure, but he kept watch. He moved between the door and the window, checking both. Outside, snow erased footprints fast. Good. The fewer signs of life here tonight, the better. Still, something gnawed at him. Not fear, not yet, but the sense that whoever had wired that woman to the post had not expected her death to be quiet. Men like that always wanted witnesses, and when the snow cleared, they'd come looking for her, even if they didn't know where she'd crawled away to. The infants settled at last, tiny breaths fogging the air above their blankets. Lillian slept, her chest rising shallow but steady. Gideon took a final walk around the room, banking the fire, checking the latch on the cellar door, tightening the brace on the front. Then he sat on the floor with his back against the cot, one hand resting near the edge where the smallest bundle lay. He didn't close his eyes. Not yet. The storm pressed hard against the cabin walls, and somewhere beyond the pines, a horse snorted. A single sound carried by the wind, then gone. Too far to threaten now, but close enough to remember. Morning never truly came in the Montana winter. The dark simply thinned enough for a man to see the shape of his own hands. Gideon Hale had been watching the window for an hour, counting each breath from the woman on the cot, counting each small rise of the 3 bundled lives beside the fire. Lillian stirred first. A low, broken sound pushed past her lips. Not a cry. She didn't have strength enough for that, but something like a word she couldn't finish. Gideon moved to her side. "Easy, ma'am," he said. "You're safe." Her eyes opened in slivers, blue beneath the swelling. She blinked, disoriented, searching the room until her gaze found the 3 tiny shapes wrapped in wool near the fire. Her fingers twitched toward them, just barely. "They're still here," Gideon said. "All 3. Her breath hitched, a short rasp that sounded too much like pain. She tried to lift her arm, but the motion pulled the linen of her bandages tight. Blood seeped through in a slow red bloom. "Don't try to move. You'll tear it worse." She swallowed hard, throat dry as ash. When she finally spoke, her voice was a thread. "He said girls were punishment." Gideon didn't answer. He didn't trust his voice to stay steady if he did. "He wanted a boy," she whispered. "Said a woman who gives only daughters brings curse." The words scraped out of her like they'd been carved, not spoken. Lillian closed her eyes for a moment, then forced them open again, as if the truth demanded to be said before strength left her bones. "He beat me when the first one came, harder with the second, with the third. He said the Lord judged me unfit, said I birthed 3 failures in one night." Gideon felt a cold in his chest the fire couldn't touch. "He dragged me out, tied me, left me for the cold." She gasped for air. "Said the wolves would settle it." Her voice faltered. The children stirred at the sound of their mother's struggle, tiny mules rising like sparks from the logs. Gideon knelt, adjusting their blankets, checking the warmth of each forehead. When he looked back at Lillian, he kept his tone steady. "You're alive, ma'am. They're alive. That's what matters now." She let out a slow, shaking breath. For how long? Before Gideon could answer, the latch on the door rattled, just once, light, like a twig hitting the wood. His hand went straight to the rifle propped against the wall. But the knock that followed wasn't the kind men used before forcing their way in. It was a woman's touch. "Gideon?" A voice called softly through the door. "It's Ada Quinn. I brought what you asked for." Gideon opened the door a crack, gun still in hand. Ada slipped inside, arms full of cloth bundles and a tin of salve. Snow clung to her skirt. The wind tried to come in with her, but she kicked the door shut quick. "Mercy," Ada breathed when she saw Lillian on the cot. "Is she—" "Alive," Gideon said. "For now." Ada set the bundles down near the fire. "I heard talk in town this morning." She lowered her voice. "Men riding around asking if anyone saw a woman wandering the ridge last night." Lillian flinched. Gideon steadied her shoulder with one hand. Ada unwrapped a bundle of fresh linen, small shirts, a flask of broth. "Also brought these for the little ones." Then Ada reached into her coat and pulled out a folded paper, edges stiff from the cold. A wanted notice. Gideon took it. The printed words were blunt. "Lillian Crow, unstable, dangerous, kidnapped infants, reward $40. Lillian's breath stuttered. Her eyes filled not from heartbreak. She had run out of tears long ago, but from the cruelty of seeing lies set in ink. Ada shook her head. "Men like Edgar always get their story written first." Gideon crumpled the paper in his fist. "This changes things." Ada nodded. "Sheriff Rook's out looking already. Edgar claims you stole his wife and children. Says she killed their newborn boy and ran." The lie hung in the cabin like smoke. Gideon looked at Lillian. Her lips moved. "He killed the boy. Born still. Blamed me." Ada's jaw clenched. "Then he means to finish what he started." Gideon stepped to the window, peering through the slit between the boards. Snow drifted past in soft sheets, but the woods beyond were too still, too quiet. "They'll come here," he said, "tonight or tomorrow, soon as the storm gives them room to track." Ada crossed her arms tight. "You can't fight them alone, Gideon." "I know." He checked the rifle, counted the shells, listened to the wind for hooves. None yet. But the day wasn't done. Lillian's voice cracked behind him. "If they take me, they'll kill the girls. He said he would." Gideon turned. "Ma'am," he said, "no one's taking you or those children." Ada met his eye. "You need to think ahead. Edgar will use the law first. And when that doesn't work, he'll use fire." Gideon didn't blink. "Then I'll be ready." He moved to the door, reinforced the brace with another board, then walked past the fire to check the back window. Tracks from last night were gone. Snow swallowed them whole. But the storm couldn't hide everything. Men left shadows. Always. Gideon returned to the cot, lowered himself beside Lillian, and gathered the infants closer to the fire's warmth. He didn't speak again. He didn't have to. The truth had been spoken already, by wounds, by wire, by flame waiting somewhere in the dark. And the storm outside carried the kind of silence that never lasted long. By mid-afternoon, the storm had settled into a bitter hush, the kind that carried sound farther than it should. Gideon Hale felt it before he heard it. The shift in the wind, the way the air tightened across the ridge. He stepped away from the fire, rifle in hand, and moved to the narrow slit he'd carved between the window planks. Hoofprints. Not fresh, not old, just visible enough to mean trouble had chosen its hour. Gideon tightened his grip on the rifle. Behind him, Lillian shifted weakly on the cot, struggling against the pain in her wrists. The infants slept in uneven breaths by the fire, small and worn from the night's cold. Ada Quinn had left an hour ago, promising to return by evening if she could slip out of town unnoticed. She'd warned him. If Edgar comes, he'll come smiling. Gideon knew the type. Men who hid fangs behind Sunday manners. The knock arrived soft, almost polite. 3 taps on the door, spaced like a man who didn't want to spook livestock. "Mr. Hale," a voice called. Smooth, warm, rehearsed. "Gideon, it's Edgar Crow. I'd be obliged if you opened this door so we could speak neighbor to neighbor." Lillian froze. Breath caught, shoulders trembling beneath the blanket. Gideon didn't open the door. Instead, he stepped between it and the cot, rifle low, barrel pointed toward the floor, but ready to rise in half a heartbeat. "I know you're in there, friend," Edgar continued, voice gentle as butter melting in a skillet. "Snow's full of your tracks, mine too. No shame in that." Gideon said nothing. Silence stretched. Then Edgar's tone shifted. Still friendly, but wrapped in something colder. "I just want my wife returned. And my children." Gideon kept his back straight. "She's not fit to stand," he called through the door. "No one's going anywhere." There was a pause outside. A long one. Then a soft, mirthless laugh. "Mr. Hale, it seems you misunderstand the nature of things. My wife belongs with me. The law agrees. I've brought a notarized statement from the county witnessing her condition and her mental instability." Gideon's jaw tightened. "I also have the papers naming those infants as mine." Edgar's boots crunched closer. "So if she's in that cabin, she's there against my will." Another knock, firmer now, no longer pretending kindness. "You're a God-fearing man, Hale. Open this door so we can settle it right." Gideon stepped closer, planting his shoulder against the frame. "Not today." A soft sigh sounded from the other side. Too soft, too disappointed, too calculated. Then another voice spoke, rougher. "Boss, want us to try the hinges?" "No," Edgar said sharply. "We're civilized men. We give him a chance." A beat. Then Edgar leaned close enough Gideon could almost feel the man's breath through the wood. "You have until sunset," he murmured. "After that, Sheriff Rook rides with me. He'll bring the warrant. You'll open this door for him." Gideon's hand flexed around the rifle stock. "And when the law's with me," Edgar added softly, "there won't be a thing you can do to keep her." Footsteps shifted. Snow crunched. The men moved back toward their horses. Gideon tracked their positions by sound alone. One to the left, one to the right. Edgar to the center. Saddles creaked. Reins snapped. But before Edgar mounted, he spoke one last time. "Mr. Hale, shelters built on lies don't last long. Fires take 'em. Winds take 'em. Men like me take 'em quicker." Then the horses pulled away, hooves cracking over frozen earth. Gideon stayed at the door long after the sound faded. He set the rifle down only when he knew the men had reached the far slope. Even then, he checked the hinges, tested the brace, slid the second bar into place. Behind him, Lillian whispered, "He won't stop." "No," Gideon answered. "He won't." He moved to the window and looked out over the ridge. The storm had cleared just enough to show the world in hard lines. Black pines, white drifts, the thin smear of tracks heading toward town. There were 3 sets instead of 2. A third horse he hadn't heard. A scout, maybe. A witness. Someone Edgar trusted. Gideon shut the plank tight. He crossed the room fast, rearranging crates, pulling the iron kettle in front of the door as a low barrier. Then he dragged the heavy trunk from under the bed and set it beneath the window. The cabin tightened around them like a fist closing. Lillian winced. "You can't fight him alone." "I won't," Gideon said, "but I'll fight him if he makes me." He knelt beside the mattress, checking the infants, touching each small forehead, counting each tiny breath. Then he rose and stoked the fire, feeding it until sparks leapt toward the chimney. Outside, the wind picked up again. Not a storm, just warning. Gideon tightened every latch in the room, listening to the sound of the wood settling under the pressure of cold and threat. Ada's words echoed back to him. "If Edgar can't get you with law, he'll get you with fire." Gideon looked at the door once more. Sunset wasn't far, and men like Edgar never waited for their own deadlines. Gideon Hale didn't waste time once Edgar Crow's riders disappeared over the ridge. A man could lie. Weather could lie. Tracks could lie. But the quiet that followed trouble never did. It meant more was coming. He set the rifle on the table, checked the shells, then moved to the cot where Lillian Crow tried and failed to push herself upright. "Ma'am," he said, steady as a winter beam, "I need you on your feet for a moment." She stared at him like he'd asked her to lift a barn. "I can't." "You can," Gideon answered, sliding an arm behind her shoulders. "Not to fight, to survive." She winced as he helped her stand. Her wrists shook under their bandages, legs quivering from exhaustion. But she stayed up. Barely. The 3 infants slept in shallow breaths near the fire, unaware of the line tightening around them. Gideon handed Lillian the small revolver he kept in the trunk. She blinked. "I don't know how to—" "I'll show you." He guided her hand, thumb against her knuckles so the recoil wouldn't break her grip. Her fingers trembled. Her breathing hitched. But the barrel stayed pointed where he placed it, toward the far wall, away from the children. "Don't think about aiming," he said. "Think about stopping whatever's coming through that door." Lillian swallowed hard. "He'll come with more men." "Then we don't give him a clean shot." Gideon shifted her feet gently. "Stand like this. Weight on the back foot. Makes it harder to knock you down." She tried. The strength wasn't there, but the stubbornness was. "Good," Gideon said. "Now squeeze the trigger, don't yank it." Her first dry trigger pull shook her whole arm, Her second steadied. Her third found rhythm. "That's enough," Gideon murmured. "Save the rest for when you need it." She lowered the revolver, sweat beading across her brow. "I don't want to kill anyone." "You ain't aiming to," Gideon said. "You're aiming to live." The cabin creaked under a gust of wind. A loose board rattled. Lillian jumped. Gideon didn't. He moved fast, checking every window again, every brace, every board he'd nailed in place. Then he crossed to the back wall and pulled aside the bearskin rug that hid the trapdoor. The cellar. Cool earth breathed up from the darkness below. Lillian stared into it like it was a grave. Gideon didn't soften his voice. "If things go bad, you take the girls down there. Stay quiet. Don't come up till I call you." She shook her head. "Not without you." "That's not your choice, ma'am. It's mine." She almost argued. He saw it in the tightening of her jaw. But the truth sat too heavy on her shoulders. She was barely standing. Running was impossible. Fighting was a last line. Surviving meant obeying. Then a knock, light, fast, hit the door. Not Edgar. Sheriff Rook. "Gideon?" Rook called, breath smoking through the crack under the threshold. "Crow was in town. Said you were holding his wife against her will. He wants me to bring a warrant tonight." Lillian flinched. Gideon's hand tightened on the revolver he'd set aside. Rook's voice dropped. "Listen close. I can't stop him official-like. He's got paperwork, and money, and men. But I'll tell you this. Edgar Crow's never waited for a warrant in his life." Gideon exhaled through his teeth. "You expect him tonight?" "I expect him any minute he thinks you ain't ready." Rook's boots crunched in the snow as he stepped back. "I wasn't here. You didn't see me. Board that door tighter. And Gideon, don't hesitate." Silence returned. Thin, sharp, bent under pressure. Gideon slid the rug back over the cellar door. Lillian whispered, "They'll burn the cabin." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "That's the part of Crow you ain't seen yet." She gripped the edge of the table for balance. "Then why stay? Why not run?" Gideon pointed to the 3 sleeping infants. "Because they won't live an hour in this cold if we try." Lillian's breath shook. Her knees buckled. Gideon steadied her before she hit the floor. "You said we're not fighting to win," she whispered. "We're not," Gideon answered. "We're fighting to outlive whatever walks through that snow." He led her back to the cot, settled her under the blanket, then placed the revolver in her lap. Her fingers closed around it with new resolve. Outside, wind scraped against the cabin like fingers testing for weak spots. Snow hissed against the shingles. Something distant, maybe a horse, maybe just the storm, shifted through the valley. Gideon checked the door one more time. The hinges were strong. The brace was solid. But men didn't always use doors when they aimed to take what wasn't theirs. He banked the fire, kept the flames low. Shadows lengthened across the room, bending around the crates he'd stacked as cover. Then he sat near the infants, rifle across his knees, listening to the storm breathe and the quiet settle heavy enough to break. You didn't need a preacher to know what that quiet meant. It meant the night hadn't shown its worst yet. The night came early on the mountain, thick and heavy, smothering the last traces of daylight until the cabin stood alone in a bowl of darkness. Gideon Hale kept the fire banked low, feeding it only enough to keep the children warm. The flames whispered instead of roared. No shadows danced, no light leaked through the chinks. A man could walk right past the place and never see a glow. At least, that was the hope. Lillian Crow lay awake on the cot, eyes reflecting what little firelight there was. Her breath came tight and shallow, as if each minute pulled her closer to a truth she didn't want to face. "Gideon," she whispered. He raised a hand for silence. Then they both heard it. Not hooves, not voices. Something softer, something worse. A crackle, a pop, a low, hungry hiss carried on the wind. Gideon moved to the window slit and peered out. Orange. Faint at first, then growing. Not at the cabin, yet. At the barn. The old hay barn he'd built in his first winter here. Dry wood. Dry hay. One spark would take it. Someone had given it more than one. Gideon stepped back from the plank, jaw tight. They lit the barn. Lillian's breath caught. He said he'd bring the sheriff. He lied. The wind shifted, pulling smoke toward the cabin. A moment later came the unmistakable roar as the flames climbed higher, swallowing the beams, reaching for the sky. Shadows twisted across the snow like long, clawed hands. The barn door buckled inward. Fire poured out. The infants stirred, mewling at the smell of smoke. Gideon crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling down coats, blankets, anything he could wrap around them. "They're trying to drag us out," he said. "Heat the air, fill the room with smoke, make us run where they want us." Lillian tried to stand. Her legs gave out. She gripped the table to hold herself up. "They'll burn the cabin, too," she whispered. Gideon didn't answer. He was listening. The fire's roar swallowed sound, but beneath it, thin, sharp, cutting through the night, came another noise. Horses, moving, positioning. He scanned the window again. 2 riders, half hidden in the trees, waiting for the flames to do their work. Lillian clutched the revolver. "They want you to carry us out, in the open." Exactly. The barn collapsed in a thunder of sparks. Embers scattered across the snow like falling stars. Flames crawled low along the ground where hay had blown earlier that day, inching closer to the wooden fence that circled the cabin. Gideon's voice went flat. "We move now." He lifted all 3 infants into one thick, wool-lined blanket, tying the ends to form a sling across his chest. Their weight barely registered. Fear outran gravity tonight. "Take this," he said, handing Lillian his coat. "We go out the back. Stay low. Don't speak." She nodded, trembling but resolute. Gideon kicked aside the bearskin rug and opened the back hatch he'd carved years. "I'll go as a winter coal chute." Cold air surged in, bringing snow and silence. He motioned for Lillian to crawl through. She winced but obeyed, pushing herself into the narrow passage. Gideon followed, pulling the hatch shut behind them. Outside, smoke drifted low across the ground, kept down by the heavy winter air. The fire's glow painted the snow in shifting reds and golds. Gideon guided Lillian to the shadow of the chimney stack first, then toward the tree line. A gun clicked somewhere to their right. Gideon shoved Lillian behind a pine trunk, shielding the infants with his body. He peeked around the bark. One rider dismounted, scanning the yard. The other pointed toward the back of the cabin. "Smoke's drifting that way." They'll come out where the wind's clean. Gideon felt Lillian tense beside him. He lifted 3 fingers. Wait. Then 2. Ready. Then 1. Move. They crept from tree to tree, drifting with the shadows, using the smoke as cover. The fire's roar masked the sounds of their feet crunching through the snow. But they didn't get far. A branch snapped somewhere behind them. Too close. Another rider, hidden deep until now, spurred forward trying to cut them off. Gideon didn't hesitate. He raised the revolver with one hand and fired once. The muzzle flashed sharp against the dark. The shot clipped the man's stirrup, sending the horse rearing. The rider toppled sideways into the snow with a yell, gun skittering out of reach. "Run," Gideon ordered. Lillian did, cradling the revolver tight to her chest, breath ragged, steps irregular but determined. Gideon stayed behind her, shooting twice more to scatter the others, then sprinted to catch up. Smoke thickened, flames bent in the wind. Behind them the barn groaned its last and fell inward, sending a rush of sparks across the clearing. Ahead, still too far, the safety of the forest waited. But Gideon heard hooves gaining. 2 riders. Fast. He counted his remaining bullets. Too few. He tightened the sling across his chest, heard June whimper, felt Lillian stumble but refused to fall. The riders closed in, and the cabin behind them glowed brighter with each passing second, flames crawling higher up the fence rail like a promise of worse to come. The law wasn't coming tonight. Fire had taken its place. The forest swallowed them in a rush of black trunks and drifting smoke. Snow clung to the branches overhead, dropping in heavy clumps as Gideon and Lillian fought their way between the pines. Behind them, the fire's glow pulsed like a dying sun, lighting the world in violent flashes. Gideon could hear the riders gaining. 2 men, 2 sets of hooves, 2 pistols waiting to finish what the flames had started. He shifted the sling of infants higher across his chest and grabbed Lillian's arm as she stumbled over a root. She kept moving, breath sharp, legs shaking, but she didn't fall. The revolver clutched in her hand trembled with every step. "Keep going," Gideon muttered. "Don't stop." A bullet tore through a branch overhead. Bark sprayed across Gideon's face. The mare he'd left behind screamed once in the distance, then went silent. The riders were close. Too close. Gideon ducked behind a boulder, pulling Lillian down with him. Another shot cracked through the air, shattering a pine limb above their heads. He counted the echoes. 1 rider to the left, 1 to the right. Trying to box them in. He set the infants down for 1 heartbeat, just long enough to reload the last 2 cartridges he carried. His hands moved fast, practiced, precise. The forest wind hissed, snow swirled low. The smell of smoke clung to everything. The left rider appeared first, weaving between the pines, gun raised. Gideon rose, fired once. The shot ripped through the man's shoulder, spinning him sideways. He toppled from his saddle, hitting the ground hard. His horse bolted into the trees. "1 down," Gideon muttered. But his own gun clicked empty. He didn't have time to curse. The second rider burst through the smoke, coming in fast, nearly on them. The man leaned in the saddle, pistol aimed straight for Lillian's chest. "Ma'am, down," Gideon barked. He shoved her to the ground and reached for the fallen rider's gun, but it was too far. Snow blurred his vision. The babies whimpered in the sling. The horse thundered closer. Lillian pushed herself to her knees, revolver shaking in her hands. Her breath rattled with fear and pain. but she didn't lower the weapon. The rider cocked his gun. Gideon lunged, but Lillian beat him. She steadied her wrist against a sapling, breath stuttering, eyes sharp with something beyond terror. And she fired. The shot hit the rider clean, center mass, knocking him backward off his saddle. His pistol flew from his grasp. The horse reared and bolted into the smoke. The forest went still. For a heartbeat, no one moved, not even the wind. Lillian lowered the revolver slowly, staring at her own trembling hand. I didn't think, I just... Gideon grabbed her arm. Not rough, just enough to anchor her. You did what you had to. His voice stayed low, steady as an iron hinge. No hesitation. That's why we're alive. She swallowed hard. Snow clung to her hair. Her knees nearly buckled, but she forced herself upright. A faint cry rose from the sling. June this time. Weak, but alive. Gideon touched the child's cheek, then scanned the trees. We need to move, he said. Where there's two, there's more. Lillian nodded, breath shallow. But as they stepped deeper into the forest, Gideon noticed the light between the trees changing. Orange again. Too bright. Too close. He turned. The fire had reached the fence line. Flames crawled up the rails, leaping from post to post. One section collapsed in a shower of sparks, sending embers drifting into the woods like deadly fireflies. The wind caught them, pushing flames toward the path Gideon and Lillian had taken. They're burning you out, she whispered. No, Gideon said. They're burning everything. He shifted the sling, lifting the infants higher against his chest. Lillian tightened her grip on the revolver, her hands bloodless from the cold and shock. They ran. Branches whipped at their coats. Roots snagged their boots. The air thickened with smoke, stinging their eyes. Gideon stayed ahead, choosing the narrowest cuts between the trees, places no horse could follow. Behind them, fire chewed through the dry grass. Ahead of them, shadows moved between the pines. No riders yet, but tracks. Fresh ones. Too fresh. Gideon stopped, listening. Nothing. Nothing but the crackle of flames crawling closer. He turned to Lillian. The cabin's gone. This whole ridge will be gone by morning. Then where? To town, Gideon said. It's the only place left to clear your name. Lillian's breath caught. The judge? And witnesses, Gideon said. We take this to the street before Crow can twist it. She looked behind them, the glow of their burning world chasing them through the trees, then nodded once. All right, she whispered. We go to town. Gideon took the lead again, the sling of infants warm against his chest, Lillian limping close behind him. Snow fell in frantic spirals around them, trying to smother the fire but failing. The riders were gone for now. The cabin was gone forever, and every step toward the valley carried the weight of one truth Gideon didn't speak aloud. If Crow couldn't kill them in the woods, he'd try again where the town would watch. Dawn broke thin and gray over the valley, painting the snow in a color that felt more like ash than morning light. Gideon Hale had walked all night, leading Lillian and the 3 bundled infants down the mountain path, cutting between rock shelves and frozen washouts where no horse could easily follow. The smoke behind them rose in a long column, a black scar against the sky. Their home was gone. Their cover was gone. Only the town remained. Long Bend wasn't big, but it held more eyes than Gideon liked. A single street lined with boardwalks, a saloon on one end, and a church on the other, with a cluster of winter-stiff townsfolk already stepping out to sweep their stoops and thresh the night's frost from their windows. Ada Quinn waited at the edge of the freight yard with her wagon hitched and tarped. "You made it," she breathed, scanning the tree line nervously. Saw the smoke from the ridge. Thought the worst. "It came close," Gideon said. Lillian leaned against the wagon's wheel, breath thin, legs trembling. She clutched the revolver beneath Gideon's old coat, hidden but ready. The infants whimpered under the blanket sling, hungry and cold, but still breathing. Ada lifted the edge of the wagon tarp. "Get in. Keep low. I've got crates stacked I'll hide you from the street." Gideon helped Lillian climb in, settling her beneath the tarp, placing the infants against her chest. Then he slid in beside her, bracing his rifle against one knee. "You sure this is the right way?" Ada whispered. "Traps coming from every side," Gideon said. "Town's the only place with a judge, and daylight's the only thing that slows Crow." Ada clucked her tongue, tightened the reins, and drove them into Main Street. The wagon creaked onto the planks, wheels crunching frost. Gideon kept one hand near the opening of the tarp, watching through a narrow slit as the town came alive around them. Folks paused to look. A wagon with covered crates wasn't unusual. A wagon driven at dawn with Ada Quinn white-knuckling the reins was. Gideon counted faces. Tom Murphy outside the general store. Old Priest McAllen sweeping the church steps. 2 ranch hands saddling horses near the livery. A pair of loafers stepping off the boardwalk outside the saloon. Mugs steaming in their numb hands. People who had seen Edgar Crow's posters. People who whispered. People whose eyes didn't know truth from ink. Ada leaned closer. "Judge Benton's due to pass through before noon. If we're lucky, we'll catch him at the station when the supply train pulls in." Gideon nodded. They needed witnesses. They needed law. They needed a voice louder than Edgar Crow's money. But they didn't get lucky. Not today. Because Edgar Crow stepped into the middle of the street before the wagon could reach the depot. He looked rested. Clean. Polished boots. Fresh shave. Hate had a way of making a man appear sharper than the blade he carried. 2 of his chasseurs men flanked him, hands resting on the butts of their pistols. Ada swore under her breath. "Lord help us." "Keep driving," Gideon murmured. "Don't stop unless he forces it." Ada's jaw clenched as she eased the wagon forward. Edgar raised a hand, smiled like Sunday service, and the whole street stopped breathing. "Ada Quinn," he called, voice smooth as varnish. "Where's my wife?" Ada kept her eyes locked forward. "Not here." "That's so." Edgar took 3 slow steps, placing himself directly in the wagon's path. His boots gleamed like he'd polished them while the barn burned. "Because rumor says you've been helping a kidnapper, harboring a woman guilty of infanticide, and associating with a man who's no stranger to violence." Gideon felt Lillian's breath falter beside him. Ada's voice cracked with anger. "You're the only violent one here, Crow." Edgar laughed softly. "Careful, miss. Words have weight." He tapped the side of the wagon with one gloved knuckle. A single tap, then another. A test. Listening for hollow places. Listening for breathing. Gideon raised the rifle, just a hair. Not enough to betray movement, only enough to brace. Edgar leaned in, voice low, carrying the poisonous ease of a man confident in the power of ink and rumor. "Bring her out, Ada. Let's end this parade." Ada didn't budge. "I don't answer to you." Edgar waved to the townsfolk now gathering along the boardwalk, pulled in by the sound like buzzards circling noise instead of scent. "Everyone knows I'm the injured party," Edgar said, raising his voice. "My wife, unstable, dangerous, stole my children and ran. This man, Gideon Hale, helped her. Harboring a fugitive is a crime, Ada, and you're driving the wagon." Whispers crawled through the crowd. Gideon could feel judgment forming like frost, slow, silent, deadly. Ada flicked the reins. "Move!" The horse surged forward. Edgar didn't move. For a moment it looked like the wagon would knock him flat. Then he slapped the horse's flank, sending it skittering sideways. The wagon lurched, crates shifting under the tarp. Lillian stifled a gasp. The infant squirmed. Edgar heard it. His smile sharpened. "There she is." He stepped back, motioning to his men. "Bring her out." Gideon tightened his grip around the rifle stock. Ada whispered, voice shaking with fury. "We can't run. He'll chase us into a corner." Gideon nodded grimly. "Then we don't run." He threw back the tarp. Lillian pulled herself upright, clutching the infants close, her wrists wrapped in bruised linen, her face battered but unbroken. The street gasped. Ada turned the wagon square so everyone could see, and Gideon Hale rose beside her, rifle angled low, not threatening, but ready. He swept the crowd with his eyes. "Judge Benton's coming through town," Gideon said, loud enough for every man on the boardwalk to hear. "And he's gonna, hear the truth." Edgar blinked. Stunned, Gideon had turned the street into a witness stand before he could. The boardwalk hushed. The saloon doors stilled. Even the wind paused. And the whole town waited for the next move. Judge Benton arrived the way winter storms did. Quiet, unannounced, and impossible to ignore. His wagon rolled up beside the depot just as Gideon Hale pulled the tarp fully back and helped Lillian Crow into the pale morning light. The judge stepped down, dusted snow from his coat, then froze at the sight unfolding on Main Street. A battered woman, 3 bundled infants, a lone rancher standing between them and a wealthy, well-dressed man. Townfolk gathered fast. Boardwalk rails creaked under their weight. Doors swung open. Voices hushed. Even Edgar Crow's hired guns lowered their hands a fraction, not in mercy, but in calculation. "Your Honor," Gideon called, steady as an iron post in the wind. "You need to hear testimony. Right here." Edgar Crow strode forward, fury polished into politeness. "Judge Benton, thank God you're here. My wife, unwell for months, ran into the wilderness with our newborn son and killed him. This man abducted her and the girls after." The lie slid off his tongue like oil. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, "Killed her own boy." Another whispered, "That's what the posters said." Lillian swayed but did not sit. She pulled her bandaged wrists into the open, letting the linen fall just enough to show the angry cuts beneath. Judge Benton's brows drew tight. "Mrs. Crow, who did this to you?" Her voice cracked, but she forced it out. "He did." Every head turned toward Edgar. "And I never had a son," she continued. I bore 3 daughters in one night. And he said, the Lord cursed me for it. Her knees buckled. Gideon caught her before she fell. Murmurs grew louder, uncertain, shifting, gathering weight. Edgar lifted both hands, palms outward, voice ringing like a sermon. She's delusional, Judge. Suffers spells. You can't trust a word. Let her finish, Benton said. Lillian swallowed hard. He tied me to a fence with barbed wire, left me for the cold, said the girls were a punishment I had to answer for. The crowd erupted. A woman near the dress shop clapped a hand over her mouth. Tom Murphy cursed under his breath. Edgar's mask cracked. That is a lie. Gideon stepped forward. I found her bound on my ridge. 3 babies in the snow, 1 barely breathing. I freed her, brought her in. That's the truth. Your truth, Edgar spat. Not the law's. Judge Benton raised a hand, silencing the street. Mr. Crow, you claim instability. Evidence? Edgar snapped his fingers. One of his men stepped forward holding the crumpled wanted notice. Ink still sharp, accusations bold. Unstable, dangerous, kidnapper. Edgar offered it like holy scripture. Signed by county authority, Your Honor. Ada Quinn pushed through the crowd then, because he paid the clerk to write it. She turned to the judge. I saw her the day after birthing those girls. She wasn't unstable. She was terrified. Edgar pointed a shaking finger at her. This woman is aiding a kidnapper. Enough. Judge Benton's voice cut clean through the morning. He studied Lillian a long moment, gaze lingering on the torn wrists, the bruised face, the way her body folded around the infants, as if shielding them from the entire world. These injuries, the judge said slowly, don't come from wandering in a storm. Lillian lifted her chin. He did it. Silence hit the street like snowfall. Edgar's face hardened. His eyes darted, calculating, cornered, planning something uglier than words. Judge Benton turned to Gideon. You're prepared to testify? Yes, sir. And you understand harboring a married woman may lead to legal reprimand? I'll answer for what I've done, Gideon said. But she won't go back with him. A murmur of agreement swept the crowd. Soft at first, then firmer, stronger, until it reached the edges of the saloon porch. Edgar saw the tide turning and snarled under his breath. Damn fools! Then he moved. Fast. A flash of metal. A pistol ripping free. Gideon shoved Lillian behind him. Judge Benton reached for cover. But the shot never came. Because another gun cracked first, from the far end of the boardwalk. A teenage ranch hand, barely 16, hands trembling but eyes steady, had fired from behind his father's freight crates. His bullet struck Edgar high in the shoulder, spinning the man sideways, his gun clattering to the ground. Gasps, shouts, boots pounding the boards. The boy shouted, voice cracking with fear and righteousness all at once. He was aiming to kill! Judge Benton raised both hands. Enough! No more shooting! Edgar lay in the snow, clutching his bleeding shoulder and cursing the entire street. The judge turned slowly, letting the crowd absorb everything they'd seen, everything Edgar had tried to twist with ink and money. This court, he declared, will hear Mrs. Crow's testimony formally once we reach my circuit office. Until then, she is under my protection, and any further attempt to seize her will be considered assault against a witness. The street erupted, some in relief, some in outrage, some in simple shock. Edgar glared at Gideon, fury boiling beneath the pain. "This isn't over." Gideon didn't blink. "No, sir, it ain't." And as Edgar's men lifted him to his feet, blood staining the snow, every soul on Main Street understood the same thing. The law had spoken. But the fight, the real fight, had only just begun. Night fell over Long Bend like a lid slammed on a pot. The streets emptied fast, doors bolted, lamps dimmed. Folks had seen enough gunfire for one day. Judge Benton lodged Lillian, the infants, and Gideon in the upstairs rooms of the town's only boarding house. Thin walls, narrow beds, creaking stairs. Not a fortress, but warmer than the ridge, warmer than the snow. Gideon didn't trust the quiet. He sat in a straight-backed chair beside the door, rifle across his knees, boots on the floorboards like anchors. Lillian lay on the bed with the three girls tucked against her belly, the dim lantern casting long shadows over her bruised face. Every time a floorboard groaned downstairs, she stiffened. "They won't stop," she whispered. "No, ma'am," Gideon said. "That's why I'm sitting here." The infants whimpered softly. Gideon checked them twice, then tightened the brace he'd rigged under the door handle. Thin wood, weak lock, but he'd make it hold. For a while. A gust hit the windows hard, rattling the whole frame. Except it wasn't wind. It was too heavy, too steady. Boots, multiple pairs. Gideon stood, rifle rising as the footsteps crept up the stairs. Slow, deliberate, trying not to draw attention. He blew out the lantern. The hallway outside darkened. The first shadow paused outside their door. A knuckle brushed the wood, barely a tap. Then the door exploded inward. Two men shoved through, pistols raised. Gideon fired point blank into the first, sending him crashing back into the hall. The second man ducked low, firing upward. The bullet tore across Gideon's thigh. Another grazed his ribs, knocking him sideways into the dresser. "Down!" Gideon barked. Lillian snatched the infants and rolled off the bed just as a third man rushed in from the stairwell. Gideon swung the rifle like a club, catching the attacker across the jaw. But blood streamed down his leg, warm and fast. Too fast. "You take the shoot," Gideon growled. Lillian hesitated, only a heartbeat. But one of the infants cried, and that decided it. She scrambled to the window where Ada had shown her the laundry rope earlier, tied to the gutter and running to the alley below. "Go!" Gideon shouted as another bullet slammed into the wall inches from her head. She hooked the blanket bundle over her shoulder, gripped the rope, and disappeared into the darkness, feet scraping wood until her boots found air. The rope hissed under her weight. Inside, a fourth man burst through the doorway, slamming Gideon back against the wall. Gideon's rifle dropped. The attacker lifted his pistol, barrel aimed square at Gideon's face. Then a shot thundered, but not from the man's gun. From behind him. Lillian, breathless, shaking, had climbed back up the last few feet of rope and slipped through the window. She stood in the broken lantern glow, Gideon's spare revolver in her hands. Her shot hit the man clean, dropping him where he stood. Gideon stared, at her, at the woman too weak to stand hours ago now holding a smoking gun. "I told you to run," he said. "And leave you for them?" she rasped. "No." Boots thundered on the boardwalk outside. Lamps lit. Shouts rose. Ada's voice, then Sheriff Rook's. Rook charged up the stairs with half the town behind him. "What in God's name?" Gideon lowered himself to the floor, blood pooling beneath his leg. Crow sent him, he said. Didn't wait for a trial. Rook looked at the bodies, jaw tightening. Then he's done. This ain't self-defense anymore. This is murder. Outside, a cell door clanged open. Long Bend had chosen its side. The ridge was quiet when Gideon Hale returned, quiet in the way graveyards were. Snow covered what was left of the barn, softening the ruin, but nothing could hide the blackened ribs of the cabin or the long scorch marks crawling across the frozen ground. He leaned heavily on his crutch, one boot dragging slightly from the wound in his thigh. Sheriff Rook's bandages held, but stiffness had settled deeper than the bullet. Lillian walked beside him, wrapped in Gideon's wool coat, the three infants bundled tight against her chest. Ada Quinn followed with a small wagon stacked with boards, nails, and the tools half the town had pressed into her hands. No one spoke at first. There was nothing polite to say over a burned home. Gideon stepped to the edge of the foundation. The stones were still warm in places, the smell of smoke clinging to the soil. He crouched slowly, pain dragging a low grunt from his ribs, and sifted through the ash. 3 flattened coins lay beneath the charred debris. Etta. May, June. He brushed them clean, rubbed each one between his fingers, then set them gently on the one unburned beam that remained. Lillian watched him, breath fogging in the cold. He meant to erase us, she whispered. Gideon shook his head. He tried. Ada moved closer, her boots crunching over the frost. Half the town's waiting for word. They'll come help soon as you give the sign. Gideon looked at the beam, then at the ridge stretching white and wide around them. The cabin had stood here 7 winters. It would stand again. Just not by itself. Put the wagon here, he said. We start with the base. Lillian shifted the infants and knelt beside him. Tell me what to do. He hesitated, out of habit, out of fear she'd fall. But she met his eyes with a steadiness he hadn't seen the night he first found her tied to a post. All right, Gideon said softly. We do this together. They worked slowly at first. Gideon marked the new frame with the butt of his hammer, dragging lines across the frost, so Lillian could see where each plank should go. Ada sorted the boards by length, driving stakes through the snow to hold the posts upright. When Gideon's leg buckled, Lillian slipped under his arm without waiting to be asked, steadying him until his balance returned. Neighbors came before noon. First Tom Murphy, carrying a load of cut timber over his shoulder. Then Mrs. Harper with blankets and a kettle of broth. Then young Caleb Bryce, the boy who'd fired the shot that saved Lillian, dragging a cart of shingles borrowed from the depot. No speeches, no fuss, just hands. Hands that lifted, hands that held, hands that rebuilt what fire tried to take. By mid-afternoon, the outline of a new cabin rose from the snow. Rough beams, bare nails, no roof yet. But a shape, a claim, a line drawn against the past. Lillian sat on a stump feeding the girls warm broth one at a time, her wrists wrapped clean and her hair tucked beneath a borrowed scarf. Gideon limped over, carrying a long plank he had sanded smooth. He set it across 2 sawhorses. Then he carved. Slow strokes at first, then deeper, firmer, the blade tracking across the wood grain with the certainty of a man putting down scripture. Lillian leaned forward. What are you making? A place for the girls, he said. A start. He stepped aside so she could see. Across the length of the plank, each letter carved clean, each stroke deliberate, was a single word: worthy. Lillian pressed a hand to her mouth, not from sorrow, not from fear, but from the weight of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. Gideon lifted the plank, carried it to the new cabin wall, and fastened it above what would soon become the girl's sleeping nook. The word settled into the timber the way roots settle into soil. He turned back to Lillian. "We'll finish the walls before night," he said. "Roof tomorrow. After that, the rest'll come." She met his gaze. "We're staying? Here?" Gideon planted his crutch in the snow, squared his shoulders against the wind, and looked out over the ridge he'd lived on alone for so many years. "It's home," he said, "and you're safe in it." Lillian nodded once, lifting the infants closer. Ada wiped her eyes with the back of her glove. "Well," she said, clearing her throat, "then let's build the rest before the Lord brings another storm." Gideon set another beam into place. Lillian handed him a nail. The hammer rose. The ridge echoed with the sound of a new beginning. Not soft, not easy, but chosen. And the snow, quiet at last, fell gently over the foundation of a family that fire could not erase.